My Gavanin, welcome to my channel. I'm Kimberell Eventide, and I have a very special guest today to discuss all about the Elven language and the elves and Tolkien, and I'm very excited to have him to chat with me tonight. David Salo worked on the Lord of the Rings films, and he'll tell us a little bit about his experience with that. He has actually wrote a book called A Gateway to Sindarin, which you may like to pick up, and this is what he's going to give you a little bit more information about when I ask him. And yeah, we're going to have a nice chat here about all about elves and his take on elves and the Elven language. And David, would you like to take it away?
Certainly. My Govanman, everyone. So I've been working with these things for a long time. I'm 50 now. And so I was 35 when I got involved with the Lord of the Rings movies. And
can I just say that's Elvish magic right there? You do not look 50. But carry on.
Yeah. And that was after many, many years of working with things related to Elvish. So would you like to hear about that?
I would. I would like your whole story, because you were telling me that you read Tolkien before the Lord of the Rings movies. And I mean, this is basically your childhood, right? So yes, give us your whole story.
Yeah. So I was reading The Hobbit when I was quite young, probably 5 or 6. I remember that as being one of the earliest books that I read. And I remember being fascinated by all the things that kind of set it apart and made it a world of its own. And I remember studying the maps. I still love maps. And the secret writing, the moon letters and the different runes that were part of that, and sitting and trying to figure those out. And at the time, I tried to get into the Lord of the Rings, but it took me a long time before I could read it all the way through, because it was more advanced than a 6-year-old could really manage. I also liked looking at the maps there and looking in the appendices and seeing the different letters. And so those were things that I wanted to learn about. When I was in 4th grade, maybe, the Silmarillion had been released shortly before then, and I had a friend who was also very interested in Tolkien's world, and so we sat together and we read the Silmarillion and looked at the appendices in the back, which give some of the Quenya and Sindarin roots, and we looked at the appendices and memorized the names of the letters of the Tengwar letters. And so I was kind of imbibing Elvish at the time, and it was sort of soaking into my bones. It was fun, and I think both of us thought that it had a sort of deeper meaning for us than just being a book, just being entertainment. And so I kept on with the idea of doing things with this, even though I didn't really have sort of the linguistic background. I didn't have access to much that would help me understand the actual structure that Tolkien had put into his languages at that time. But I remember when I left for college, and that was I was 16 when I went to college. I took along some of the Tolkien's works that had additional information about his language. I'm going to sit down with these. I'm going to study these. So I also studied linguistics in college and got a much better background. And I sat down and worked with similar languages, reading about the history of Welsh, for instance, gave me greater insight into what Tolkien was doing with his Sindarin language. So Tolkien imagined Elvish as being like a branching tree of languages, very much the way that Indo-European is a tree of languages that includes uh, English together with German and Norwegian and other languages out on one branch, and then Latin and its descendants, French and Portuguese and Spanish on another branch, and then more distantly related languages like Albanian and Armenian further away. So Tolkien had this idea of this huge branching tree where all of these Elvish languages would have their places, but he only really focused on two, Quenya and Sindarin. Quenya being the language of the Noldor elves, Sindarin being the language of the Sindar who had stayed in Middle-earth, while the Noldor and other related elves, the Teleri and the Vanyar, had gone across the sea to Aman, to Eldamar. And they, but he sketched out in varying degrees of detail other languages. And so Sindarin is more evolved than Quenya. So if Quenya is similar to an ancient language like Greek or Latin, then Sindarin would be more like a medieval language, like Old English or Old French or Old Welsh on another branch of the tree. So it's not directly descended from Quenya, but its ancestor, what I called Old Sindarin in my book, was similar, more alike to Quenya because they were both they both had features of greater antiquity that were closer to the common Eldarin from which both of those came. Common Eldarin is closer to the trunk of the tree, but it's not the oldest. So the oldest form that Tolkien imagined was what he called primitive Quendian. And that would be what the elves would have spoken when they first awoke at the lake of Cuivienen. They opened their eyes and looked up, saw the stars, and they cried aloud, Ele! It's just this cry of wonder. And from that, the stars got their names. So in Sindarin, that's El, and in Quenya, it's Elen. And these languages then split apart. So when the Eldar left Cuivienen to go west to try to escape from the monsters of Morgoth and come closer to the Valar, other elves stayed behind, the Avari, and those had their own languages, and those were different branches of the tree. And then the Vanyar, the Noldor, became one branch, the Teleri became another branch, and then the Telerin split into Telerin as it was spoken in Eldamar, and Nandorin, which is the ancestor of the Sylvan languages, and Old Sindarin, which then evolved into the Sindarin, which I tried to describe in my book.
And Sindarin is the one that basically the Lord of the Rings movies use because it's the newest version of Elvish, right?
For the most part, you do hear a little bit of Quenya in the Lord of the Rings movies. But as I explained it, when I became not just the translator, but also sort of the linguistic advisor on the movies, I was like, at the time that the Third Age comes in, Quenya is almost, it's not really a spoken language anymore. It had ceased to be a spoken language in Middle-earth in the First Age. And so elves usually speak Sindarin among themselves, and the Dunedain, the descendants of the Númenóreans, who are the people of Gondor, and the Dunedain of Arnor, of whom Aragorn is one. They use Sindarin as well in their own fashion and are able to communicate with the elves that way. So I had to find the right way to say, okay, this is an appropriate place where we can use Sindarin. Here's a good place where we could use Quenya, for instance, in some of the spells. And here's where it would not make sense to use Elvish. Here there would be another language, it would be Dwarvish or one of the Orcish dialects. And so I had sometimes to go back and forth with the dialogue on what would be most appropriate. But of course, this depends on me having a lot of knowledge, which I didn't have back when I was, first going to college, trying to figure out all of these things. Another thing happened after I left college. I became involved with an organization you may have heard of it called the Society of Creative Anachronism, the SCA. They do reconstructions of medieval culture, and they hit each other with swords and things like that. So it's I didn't do that part. I was actually part of the heraldry group, and they were interested in because some of the people would. One of the things that the heralds did was not just to deal with people's requests for coat of arms, but also their nomenclature. People would want to have names in Old French or Old Italian, or they want a Viking name in Old Norse, and some of them wanted to have names in Elvish. And there wasn't actually a rule that said you couldn't do that, but the thing was nobody, while you could make judgments about whether an Old Norse name was correctly formed or not, nobody had the knowledge about whether you could do this with an Elvish name. And I was like, I could write a few pages of just, maybe 10 or 15 pages describing what would be necessary to make a good Elvish name. And let me just try sort of put down some of the notes about things that I've learned. So I started doing that. Actually, I was no longer really involved with the SCA at that point, but I thought it would be the kind of thing that they would be interested in. And it took me, as I was working on it, and I was talking to other friends who were interested in the same sorts of things, friends that I had met online, and found that they were interested in it as well. And they sort of gave me encouragement to keep on writing. And I just found myself writing chapter after chapter and sending them off to my friends and asking for criticism. And after a while, all of this turned into a book. I was not expecting that at that point. I was expecting it just to be a sort of a brief pamphlet. But there turned out to be a lot more interest in that than I was.
And a brief pamphlet, if I can tell them how many pages. There's 38. 438 pages that you worked on with this. That's incredible.
And of course, in the process of doing it, I learned a lot more than I knew when I started out. I had to do more study. I had to collect more material, whatever was available then. Some other things have come out since then, which would have made me modify some of my conclusions, but not the broad overall thrust of the book. And I would occasionally see people looking, asking if there was somebody who knew something about Elvish on some of the online discussion groups that I was following. And so if they were saying, does somebody know something about Sindarin? I'll be able to say yes, actually. And so I found myself getting involved with doing things. There was a gaming company, which no longer exists, called the Middle Earth Role-Playing Game. And they wanted somebody to sort of revise the books that they had produced, gaming books describing parts of their world. So I was like, sure, I can take a look at that. And so I did that, and I was like, yeah, you can't do these things. This name is okay, but it doesn't mean what you think it does. And so I ended up rewriting a lot of that. And so around about the time that I was finishing up with what they wanted for their game, I started hearing stories about somebody in New Zealand. Why New Zealand? Getting interested in creating a Lord of the Rings movies, and I was like, oh, that's never going to happen. But it would be nice if it did. And gee, I really hope they get the languages right. So I heard different rumors, some of them correct, some of them not so correct, about what was going on with that, and I paid attention. But I got some encouragement from some of my friends to see if I could get involved with that in some way. And at the same time, I got an inquiry from somebody who actually knew someone who knew someone who knew Peter Jackson, and that person was someone else who worked on the movie. And I was like, yeah, if they're looking for somebody, I could do it. And he was like, okay, well, I'll send your name on. And then I put together a resume, just describing some of the things that I had done, as well as my background in linguistics. And I sent that to New Zealand, and another friend sent a sort of letter of recommendation. So they got a few things saying with my name on it, and I got eventually a call out of the blue a few months after I had sent these letters in, saying, would you be interested in doing some work for us on the languages for the Lord of the Rings? And I was like, yes. I didn't see exactly what that was, but it was in my heart. And then I found myself working with John Howe, who was an illustrator and who was doing some of the work on designing some of the props that they would use.
Yeah, and one of his sketchbooks, actually. Yeah.
And so they said, can you translate this? Can you come up with something to go on these blades that we're designing, these pieces of weaponry? And I was like, okay, so they don't want me to just translate things, they want me to actually come up with something of my own. So I did. I came up with a little short thing that I thought was appropriate for Sting.
So you know how to write Elvish script, the Kirth?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Wow.
So there are actually two Elvish scripts. There's the Tengwar, which is more normal sort of lettering, and there's the Kirth, which is the runic lettering. And there are different ways that this is used. So like there's one way you can use it for Elvish, one way you can use it for Dwarvish, another for the human languages. So I did get asked and gave some advice on those things.
Can I ask you something, David? How does somebody learn the alphabet with Tengwar and Kirth? Like, does Tolkien have like a map of all the letters, like, that are used in the Elvish alphabet? Is there a master key or anything like that exists, or did you have to piece together everything?
I did have to piece together a lot. There are charts of both Tengwar and the Kirth in Appendix, I think it's E, of the Return of the King. And but it's a little complicated because he's like, there are many different ways in which these letters were used, and you can, depending on which language is appropriate to them. So I had to use that, and I had to use actual examples where Tolkien had written words in these different languages. So I found a publication called The Road Goes Ever On, which was a series of songs, and Tolkien had put this appendix in the back of it. So it was Tolkien's poems set to music, and Tolkien had, for sort of adorning the book, had written out Namaria in Tengwar, and had also written out A Elbereth Gilthoniel, the whole chant there in Tengwar, and both of those make use of the same letters but in very different ways. So I was able to study that and other things that he had written at different times. All right, so I had sent this stuff off to John Howe, and John Howe sends a message back to me saying, this is fine, but can you write me something that will kind of justify what you said, because we hear a lot of different things from different people and we don't really know who to trust. Can you explain what you're doing here? And I was like, sure, I can, but if I have to do that for every single thing that I send, this is going to take a long time. So I sat down, and with my few words that I had written out for this one piece of weaponry for Bilbo and Frodo's sword or dagger sting, I had come up with this theory of how it was originally used to fight spiders in Gondolin in the First Age. And so, because there's this thing that Frodo says in The Return of the King, that there were webs of fear in the ravines of Gondolin from which it came. So I gave an explanation of where I had gotten each word from, what the basis of the grammar was, how I was putting these different things together, different changes in consonants that I was using, and just came out with this multi-page explanation of this very, very short phrase. And so I sent that off to John Howe, and I got a message back saying, yeah, that's good. We don't need this from you anymore. And so after they went to their into their workshop, what they eventually came up with was this.
Oh, wow. Is that the original prop?
This is not the original prop. This is a replica version.
It's wow.
And so the writing starts off here, and what it says is Maignas ein estar nin Maignas, and so the meaning of that is sharp point, is my name. Dagnir, and then it continues on the hilt there. In Yngil im, the bane of the spiders am I. So wow. Sharp point is my name. I am the spider's bane.
That's interesting.
So that was one of the first things that I did. So I actually have a number of replica props, but this is the only one that I have that's not in storage right now. And
you don't have them hung on your wall proudly?
No, I used to, but I moved recently. I don't have that much wall space, and I'm
downsizing.
So I worked on that for let's see, from about 1998 or 99 to 2003. And in the middle of all of that, I got a lot of requests for to do some publicity after the Fellowship of the Ring came out. And since I had mentioned in one of my interviews that I had been working on a book, after a while, a representative of a publisher, the University of Utah Press, called me up and said, "You interested in getting that published?" And I was, yes, I would. I had to do more work on it, but I got that done. And so I think it was not actually, may not have been published until after the movies came out, but I was working on that throughout. So yeah, it was published in 2004. And so that was kind of a big deal for me so far. The first and only book that I published. There are things that I would do a little bit differently about it now, but on the whole, I'm quite pleased. I'm especially really pleased with the look of it. This kind of silvery glowing cover. It's a little bit different from what you've got. This is a hardback version.
Oh, yes.
And I designed the cover. It's of course based on the Doors of Moria, but with some other symbols on it that reflect the Sindar elves.
Read this. What does this say?
Annon na Evelen. So Annon is gateway. Na tu Evelen Elvish, because the Sindar did not call their own language Sindarin. That's the Quenya word for it, because the Noldor, when they came back to Middle Earth, met these strange elves speaking a strange language, and they called them the Sindar, the Grey Elves. But as far as they knew, until the Noldor came back, the Sindar were just elves. That was what they called themselves, Evil. And Evelen is the word for Elvish. So,
yeah. And on that note, we can talk a little bit more about, well, I had some people ask me, they wanted to know if you were able to assist any of the characters, the Elven characters in the Lord of the Rings. Like, did you work with Legolas, or, I mean, not directly, but did you help with the dialect of those certain Elven characters?
So I was in Wisconsin throughout the filming of The Lord of the Rings, and there were two dialect coaches, Andrew Jack and Roisin Carty, who were in New Zealand and who were working directly with Orlando and Liv and Viggo and anybody else who had to speak in one of these languages. And so I got asked early on to provide some recordings and some video of what these languages would sound like. And this was, we're still in the sort of digital infancy of the art, infancy of the digital age. So it was often you had to do very creative things to get information back to them. I couldn't just like email video the way I could now. So I actually had to go out and buy a video camera, which I'd never had before, and make some little video cassettes that I could send back to New Zealand. And so I gave them samples in Quenya and Sindarin and Entish and Orcish and Dwarvish, so that they would have some idea of what these would sound like. But once they understood what the connection was between the transcriptions that I was giving them and what the sounds were supposed to be like, they didn't need that kind of help anymore. They could just take what I had written when I sent it and render it into sounds so that the actors would understand. Just once in a while, I had to write something out in phonetic spelling. I recall there was one singer who wanted her words done in the International Phonetic Alphabet, so I got a chance to do that.
Is that singer Enya, or who's the
No,
singer?
it wasn't. I don't remember her name now.
Okay.
Enya definitely did do some of the singing for a later movie.
Yeah. And a lot of songs actually for Lord of the Rings. How did she learn Elvish? I wonder. Did she work with those dialect coaches then? And
I don't know. I know that I had very little to do with those songs. I did get contacted by, I believe it was Roma Ryan, who is part of Enya and who does mostly the songwriting, the lyrics for songs that Enya sings. And it was basically, I have these words, could you, in Quenya, could you check them, make sure that they're okay? But as it turned out, there wasn't really anything that I could find fault with. That was Mornie Utulia, Darkness Has Come. And so it was, because I was already a fan of Enya, I was thrilled to get that, but I didn't really get a chance to contribute very much to their work. So where they got their knowledge of Elvish languages, I don't know. I know that I think Roma Ryan came up with a different invented language of her own called Loxian of the Enya Elves. I don't know much about that at all.
So maybe they were just Tolkien lovers like you and learned, throughout their life the same way. And I'm sure that the actors probably just listened to your, to your tapes or to your videos and learned that way. And, what is so I wanted to ask you about this, and you can give us your opinion. A lot of people think that the Lord of the Rings movies, they didn't quite fit the description of elves in in actual Tolkien's books. What was your opinion about the movies and the way that the elves were presented? And would you tell us a little bit about your idea of elvenness and if that was achieved? And what do you think of the elves of Tolkien? Like, what do they represent to you?
That's a very complex question. I don't know if I can do it justice, but I'll do my best. I was overall pleased with the movies as a whole. Individual scenes, some of the structure, there are things that I have problems with, innovations, things that came in that weren't in the books. Maybe some things that were in the books that shouldn't have been kept in. You can always get nitpicky about all of those things, but the question is it an enjoyable piece of creative work? Is it something that will get people interested in the books? Is it something that conveys some of the ways in which elves live? I think the answer is yes. But the basic problem is if you're going to have elves appear on screen, they're going to be played by human actors. There's no way around that. And so there's always going to be something in the way in which an elf in the imagination lives, which you can't reproduce on screen. There's always going to be a little something that's ineffably magical about them. So you remember that it's kind of a play. It's a representation. It's not, we're not seeing what elves would exactly look like. And you have to make allowances for that, just as when you're watching the fairies in the Midsummer Night's Dream, these are not what English fairies would actually have been imagined as, but it's just, it's a play. I think Elvenness is going to mean a little something different to you, to me, to others who are listening here. And Tolkien had his own, I think, by the end of his life, very focused ideas of what uh, Elvenness was like, and that would be something that's a little bit different from all of ours as well, because he had his own personal angle on it, and he had his own way of imagining it through the things that he was good at. Um, so we get most of our very direct ideas of uh, Elvishness is actually through those languages, through Quenya and Sindarin, that give us Tolkien's idea of what the Elvish aesthetic is like, and to some extent, through some of his art, and especially through his writing and lettering, we get some idea of the visual aesthetic. And yet there are some things that Tolkien can only allude to, can only suggest, because he wasn't a musician. So he can describe Elvish music, but each of us has to have our own imagined way of what Elvish music is going to sound like. And if you decide that you're going to sit down and try to write music that sounds Elvish, every musician is going to come up with something a little bit different, and that's fine. That's Tolkien imagined himself as finding sort of this corner of his world which he could expand on, and at one point in his life he had this idea that other people would be able to, other minds and other hands is how he put it, would be able to come in and find other ways of expressing it in drama and music and so forth. And so that was his original vision, was that he would create this kind of grand mythopoeia, and then everybody could have a little piece of it. And by the time he got into his middle ages, he was beginning to think that that whole idea was absurd. But if he'd lived to our time, he would be able to see how people are actually managing to do that, and to make things maybe on an even bigger scale than he ever personally thought was possible. But Tolkien's ideas about elves, I think, revolve around 2 points. One is that they're very close to the earth and to creatures of the earth, and he makes a point in one of his unpublished notes. Let's see. The Eldar tried to befriend men and to teach them to love the earth and all things that grow in it. So that's one aspect. And another, he says that that the Eldar came as soon as Arda became habitable by living things, to govern there, to perfect the arts of using and ordering the material of the earth to perfection and beauty and detail. So art history is another aspect that he sees as being central to that, and creation of things of beauty and valuing beauty in itself while still being non-destructive, not placing aesthetics above nature, but using it to be complementary with the natural order of things. And I think his own expression of Elvish languages is supposed to be consonant with that. So he's got a very definite idea of this, what to me is this very limpid, cool, pleasant flowing sound aesthetic of the languages, and which he spent a lot of time working on to try to get every word right. And when I was working on the on the movies, sometimes I would have to come up with new words and new names. And I worked very hard to try, I would sometimes come up with something that was, say, a new compound word made up of words which existed, but they just didn't sound right together. You put them together, it didn't sound Elvish. And so I always tried to keep that aesthetic in mind, and to create something that was not just capable of fitting in with Tolkien's linguistic world, but would fit in with the overall Elvish idea of beauty. And I hope I managed to succeed with that.
I agree. There's something really beautiful about learning to speak the language, and just the way that it sounds. I would love to be able to speak fluently in it. It's gorgeous. I mean, just a few things that I can say, I love saying them. And I do believe there's kind of like a power behind it. There's a certain energy that it kind of elevates. It elevates people, when they speak it. It makes them, I guess, like kind of, feel more empowered and more confident, and like to appreciate their own kind of natural inner beauty, and also to be able to spread beauty outwardly as well. It really is. And I wanted to ask you a question about music. Tolkien was really into music and singing. And his elves were known as, the singers. Isn't that what the Quendi mean?
No, Quendi means speakers, but there was a group, the Lindar was name that the Teleri gave to themselves, because Teleri was sort of a name given to them by others. The Vanyar and the Noldor were the foremost on the march away from Cuiviénen, and the Teleri sort of lagged behind in this long straggling line, extending over many, many miles and leagues. And so that the separation between those groups actually happened during the march, according to Tolkien's story. And so they got this name, which means the hindmost, but their own name for themselves was the singers, the Lindar.
Yeah, the Lindar.
In Telerin, it would have been Lindai.
And I mean, do you think with Tolkien's language that the music came first or the words?
I think for Tolkien, language is always primary, but I think he also saw that language, especially by a people who are devoted to beauty, would inevitably become musical. And he describes the languages of the elves as having, I think it's more melodies than any mortal can imagine.
Yeah, and they can weave visions with their words, which I loved that image in the Fellowship, where it talks about how in Rivendell, when Frodo, or no, was it Frodo or Bilbo? I forget which one, but I think it was Frodo, and he was listening to them singing, and they were weaving these images and visions with their words. I mean, that's quite a power.
That's something that Tolkien discusses in some of his other works, which he calls Elvish drama or Faerian drama, the ability of the elves to use their words and their creativity to bring images and thoughts and ideas to visual life, so that you can see the story they're telling as they tell it. And he cautions that people can get confused and think that they're seeing something real and then feel deceived once it goes away, but that the elves don't actually intend it that way. So for Tolkien, the magic of the elves is just that they are able to put a realism into their art so that it takes form exactly as it is conceived. So all of the rest of us who work with any form of art know the gap between what we imagine and what we can actually do when we come to put something on paper or canvas, or try to make music, that it doesn't always come out quite the way that we imagine it. And so for Tolkien, that gap is much smaller or non-existent for the elves.
That's a very interesting concept. And that makes sense, because in one of his quotes about the elves, he says that elven magic is really art that is not hindered, in the way that men are hindered. It's like uninhibited art. So there must be some kind of way that humans almost stop themselves to reach that level. And so if they just kind of push themselves, it really is about, I think, higher consciousness. If they just push themselves over and really kind of, reach that horizon, then they would have that same type of ability almost. It seems like Tolkien was kind of trying to say that about the elves, is that they were uninhibited, and the art came out as like magic because they had no boundaries, to what they could create. Whereas humans, they almost put boundaries on themselves, due to, just feeling maybe inadequate, or maybe they just set personal boundaries, fitting in with the society or things like that. Whereas the elves didn't have those boundaries. It was like unlimited potential, basically, they could tap into at any time.
And I think also there's part of the idea of the elvish power of art comes with this idea that the elves being much closer in sympathy with the earth and the things of the earth, so that when they use a material, they have a much better idea of its potential, and of how to make something that goes together with what its potential is, rather than working against it. And so there are many forms of art, which we see, of human art, which might be a little more alien to the elves, because they often arise from a sort of struggling with the material, with pushing things to become other than what they are made for. I'm not saying that there's no validity in those forms of art, but they're just very human kinds of art. And it's perhaps difficult to imagine some of the elves making art out of plastic, for instance. That just doesn't seem quite right. Perhaps they could, but it seems that the elvish art tries to use things that are a little more closely derived from the earth.
Yeah, completely from the earth. I mean, like you said, there is really no toxic, materials that humans would create. Everything would be derived from the earth. And I think that the closer you live with that lifestyle, where you really seek first for all your cures to illnesses and disease or whatever through the earth, then you're kind of, you're following that type of elven lifestyle, where you use and live off the earth, rather than seeking for some of the things that humans do today. Well, that explains, I think, a lot about your definition of the elvenness. Can I settle an age-old debate here? The elves sometimes are regarded, I think it's like a mix. I think they're kind of like the Norse gods and the medieval fairies. I think they're kind of this mix, a kind of a conglomerate, of the archetype of elves. Some people think that they're just like the Norse gods because Tolkien was influenced a little bit by that. What do you think the elves represented that we could kind of, I guess, align to what we know in ancient folklore and tales that we have today?
That's a good question. I don't think I'm going to be settling any disputes about that right now.
No one
Because,
can.
uh, I mean, obviously Tolkien used the word elf, which is a Germanic word,
Yeah.
was albaz or albis in ancient Germanic. But he was also quite aware. He said that this was the only appropriate word that was available, but he was also very much aware that his ideas of elves didn't necessarily match those Germanic ideas. Um, uh, we don't have a lot of um, uh, information about what the uh, people who spoke Old English meant when they talked about Ylve. That's the plural of alv um, in Old English. But we do get a general sense from the way that the word is used that they were uh, spirits. They were probably mostly invisible, but when they were invisible, when they were visible, they were very beautiful. But they were also dangerous and could potentially cause illnesses. Um, and so there were a lot of sort of varying and competing ideas. Um, we know almost less about the Alvar of Norse mythology, who have a cognate name. Some of them are supposed to be dark and dangerous, and some of them are supposed to be bright and beautiful. And we don't really have much more information about them than that. Um, so, in a way, what he's doing is kind of reconstructing what might have been uh, a a very early concept of these things, but so much of it is goes beyond anything that we have direct um, basis from in European folklore, or indeed the folklore of any people. He was definitely trying to get away from the idea of um, elves being kind of tiny uh, fairies flitting about on butterfly or dragonfly wings, which was the popular idea that had come down, especially through uh, the writing of Shakespeare and some of his contemporaries. So he was trying to get away from that, um, and yeah, he ended up, I think, creating something which was uh, uh, very much his own, but does have some parallels in other mythologies. Um, so he tried to, I think, create a being which was sort of halfway between the human and the divine.
Mhm.
Um, and divine in the sense of the kind of pagan divinities that many people believed in. Um, and that would represent maybe the best of humanity, or humanity as it might have been if it had not, in his interpretation, fallen from a greater state of grace. But then his elves also fall or become less than perfect, and indeed they're shown as having all kinds of imperfections. They have pride, they have anger, they fight among each other, they are scornful towards people who are not elves, um, they uh, can be dismissive of humans and dwarves, and even they manage to get into fights about language. They have linguistic politics. Thingol, Lord of Doriath, forbids the use of Quenya anywhere within his domains because it's the language of the people who slew his kin at Alqualonde. So the elves are very far from being an ideal, but they're also an image of what humans could be if we were a bit better than we are, if we were not so obsessed with control, with power, with dominating the earth rather than working with it. And if we had more of a regard to doing things well and beautifully rather than just doing things quickly.
That is the theme of my channel. Like I agree. I believe that if we all tap into this elvenness within us, because I believe that everybody has that potential. And it's about how far you want to go, to reconnect to nature. How far do you want to go to expressing yourself as a divine, a divine consciousness on earth? How far do you want to go with that? And that's really what this channel is about. So thank you for saying that. That was a great plug for me. A good support. Actually, that leads me to the next one here. What do you think will be in the future for the elves of Tolkien and, the language? Like, what do you feel inside of, do you feel like the Elven language will be something that eventually disappears? Or do you think that, the elves would be something that people will bring up for a long time, because Tolkien touched so many hearts and really opened so many minds? What is your idea? What do you think?
Well, I think the study, at least, of the Elvish languages is more popular now than it's ever been in my lifetime. And people are definitely trying to find ways to use it in ways which go necessarily beyond what one could imagine the elves doing, because the elves didn't live in the 21st century and would not need words to describe many of the things which are just routine parts of our lives. So if you look at the vocabulary in A Gateway to Sindarin, for instance, you will find that the words that are used there are for really basic concepts. Words describing parts of the body, animals, colors, basic activities, different kinds of geography, plants. And it's not a small vocabulary, but it doesn't have words for a lot of things which we find necessary. There's no word for meme.
Yeah.
And so if you wanted to talk about lolcats, you'd have a hard time using Elvish unless you stopped and tried to come up with new terms for that. And you can either accept that as part of the Elvish way and just try not to talk about things that elves wouldn't talk about. That's one way of looking at it. Or you can say, okay, this is a living language. People are going to use it. We're going to come up with new ways of communicating. And if people do that, eventually they may be able to create a language that's as fully useful as English, but it's not going to exactly be Quenya or Sindarin the way that Tolkien imagined it. And both of those views, in my view, are fine. You can do whatever you like with it, and we'll always have Tolkien's language or languages, because in many ways what we see in the documents that he's left us is that Quenya and Sindarin aren't like solid things. They're always evolving as he reworks them and redesigns them and changes things about them, reinvents their history. There are some pretty drastic changes because he started working on these in the 1910s, kept on working on them to the early 1970s. And there are some really drastic changes in how he imagined them over that time. And So whenever if you're trying to come up with an idea of what Quenya is, um, you may find yourself drawing on different parts from different periods within these 6 or so decades, and they may not always go together perfectly. Uh, and then you can, being a linguist, my feeling is, oh, you should try to make it feel as much like look structurally as much like a natural language, and have a coherent history and have a coherent relationship to other related languages. So, but that's how a linguist would look at it, and somebody who wants to be able to like write songs or poetry or stories in the language may not be interested in that. They may just want to say, well, let's see if there's a word somewhere that's been used for this concept, and go ahead and work on that basis without being too interested in the underlying structure or the coherence of that. And I'm not going to say that they're wrong. I I like seeing people experiment with that, but they'll be coming up with their own sort of invented languages that are sort of based on or founded on Elvish, and the extent to which people are actually going to be communicating using those is going to depend on how much they can come to a sort of agreement on what they do. And so we do have people who are working on this, sometimes together, sometimes independently, and they come up with their own visions. And sometimes people want to do the same thing with languages like Dwarvish, or possibly there are even people who are trying to communicate in Orcish. I don't know. Good luck to them. But there is a lot less to do with that. So when I worked on the movies, I had to do a lot more invention and had to come up with large chunks of Dwarvish vocabulary and grammar, based really on nothing more than what I thought could make sense and would be fitting in with other things that Tolkien had revealed about those languages. And yet that was one vision of what Dwarvish could be like. There are other people who are out there trying to design their own forms of Dwarvish, and they go according to their own lights, what they think is possible or plausible. And I'm all for that, because I'm not really trying to write things that other people can read in Dwarvish. So I don't have a need. I just did this because I was working on these movies, and they needed to have some things that were written in Dwarvish, just as they needed some things that were written in Sindarin. And although the amount of invention that I did was greater in the case of Dwarvish, even with Sindarin, where we know much more about it, I had to come up with some creative moments where I probably took a path which Tolkien, either we may find out if something gets published, didn't take, or that he wouldn't have taken if he had been in my position. So, there is, in the movies, there is a version of Sindarin which has my personal stamp on it, but I'm not going to go around telling people, this is the real Sindarin. It's not. It's my vision. And I feel the same way about any form of art which starts to spring from an idea of what Elvish is. When people make music, when people make art, I think everybody gets their chance to be as creative as they can with that. I just hope that they kind of honor these principles of beauty and being in touch with, or in communion with, what is natural.
And like you said, it's so similar to the Welsh language, and the idea that there's certain sounds that don't really change, right? Like the vowel sounds and the consonant sounds, like there's certain sounds that don't change. So it's almost like if you honor that sound, that original sound of certain, certain vowels and certain consonants and parts of a word, then you can kind of get away with, creating Elvish if you can stick to kind of the rules, because there is a certain type of rule. I mean, that's what you have written in here, right?
Right. It's
And I made a
it's
video on the
it's
vowel.
very there's a very complex sort of internal history to these languages, and it you if you want to be able to create something new in um, in Sindarin, you have to master some of those, at least, so you can know what kinds of changes there are necessary to be able to make a plural, for instance. So um, Sindarin looks on the surface to have these really complicated, inconsistent plurals. You have Adan, a human being, has the plural Edain. Evel, an elf, has the plural Evil. Um, uh, uh, Onod, an ent, has the plural Enud. And you start off looking at this and what is going on? And I had, I started doing some analysis back when I was working on the book, and was looking at a lot of different patterns, was a little confused, and then suddenly I realized there's a set of rules you can use, and it will explain how all of these things are actually aspects of one pattern. It's complex, although the underlying facts are quite simple, but the way it appears on the surface is quite complex. And if you want to create a new word in Sindarin, you're going to have to know something about how that works. But it's possible, it's doable. And I wish a great deal of luck to those people who are willing to engage with this and try to come up with things. I know that there are people who are coming up with phrases and words to do things like greet each other, and some of them make sense to me, and others of them I'm looking like, no, it takes me a while to figure out what they're trying to do. But it's possible that eventually we'll have a spoken Sindarin that most people agree on, and some of those things are going to make their way in, and there'll just be facts about that particular language. And that's the way language works.
And if we can call out some words, so Giswilin, you said, is not really, I mean, that's from the Arwen website, I think. And then you said it's more like Suilad
Well,
is one.
the word that's attested is Suilad for greeting. But
Giswilin is like a made up word, basically.
I haven't seen it myself, so I'm not really sure. I think they're using one of the hard parts with Sindarin is that there are quite a lot of different pronouns that show up, and it's hard to work out what the common pattern is there. And it looks like Tolkien may have actually gone through several different sets of pronouns as he worked through that. That was one of the very changeable things that we see. And since much of the material we have is actually like its nomenclature, its names of people and places, and the number of actual sentences, complete sentences in Sindarin is really small. I tried to collect them all together as far as I knew them. There are a few more that have been coming to light since, but even so, it wouldn't extend what I had done in the book, which was really one of my short Chapters extant text starts on page 211, continues to page 233. So that's like 23 pages, and that's with a lot of commentary. So there's not really that much in there, and trying to extract a grammar from that is fraught with all kinds of problems. So it may be that Guy is a good form of the accusative of the second person pronoun, but then again, maybe it's not.
Yeah.
And Suilen, off the top of my head, I'm thinking it would probably be more likely to be Suilon if you wanted to say I greet.
Mhm.
And Suilen might possibly be a past tense form, but probably not. So I would have issues with that. I would want to talk to whoever came up with that and say, what were you trying to do here? And they might be able to convince me, or I might be able to convince them.
What's Gi? I mean, is it GI?
Yeah, I think they're trying to use that to mean you, but I'm not really sure what the specific source of that is. I don't think it was available at the time that I wrote my book, and I think it comes from something else that's appeared since, and I just can't recall exactly where it comes from.
I remember a lot of these words come from the Lord of the Rings online game. And actually, the way that they say "my Gavanen," they say "me Gavanen," which is it's not the correct way of saying it. And so I think a lot of the words, like actually, some people have found it from. I don't think it's Blizzard, but I think it's the Lord of the Rings online game. I don't know what company. And so I think some of those words maybe come from there, and maybe that's why they're writing that. If I can just tell my subscribers here, just what the book kind of helps you with is, like, chapter 2 here says, like the A, like in English father. The same sound as but prolonged for about twice as long. So he has a very clear way of actually speaking different words and, sounding out the letters. And that's what this book is all about. It's really, I mean, in the very beginning, it's very, very direct in the idea of like where to stop a breath, almost like when you say something, where to roll your R's. I mean, basically all R's are rolled. All you have to know, which I recommend, is if you're going to get the book, you just have to remember what a long A is, what a short A. You have to know like the common ideas of what a sound is for vowels and consonants. But he goes into it and he tells you how to, sound out things. So it's a very good book. It's very long, but I think it's worth it to have in your library if you're interested in learning more about the Elvish language. Also, there's quite a bit of Elvish history, and I mean, you really talk about a lot of different things. So it's great for any kind of Tolkien fan to have. The website you can find this on is in the description in the video. You can also find it on Amazon. That's where I found mine. And any websites or books or other tools you suggest to learn about the elves more and their language, David was kind enough to tell me beforehand, so I put it in the description. He wrote down a few websites for you. I told him that the way that I learned how to speak a few words of Elvish is by listening to Tolkien's old recordings that you can find on YouTube. And, you can learn it that way, which I think is the best because that's going to the source. He was the creator of it. But what do you suggest for those who are interested in learning more about, the Elven language? Definitely your book. And any other advice you have for them?
Practice. It's when I was trying to learn it for myself, starting with really nothing other than what I could get from Tolkien's own books. I would just um, take anything that I could find and practice, memorize as many words as I could, and if I could see the way that there was um, a pattern, just work on understanding that until I had it committed to memory.
Is there any book by Tolkien that has more information on the Elven language, or um, Shaping Middle Earth? Is that by Tolkien? I think it is.
One of the later books that contains Tolkien's posthumous writings. Um, uh, in the back, one of the later parts of The Lost Road, which is the 5th volume of the History of Middle Earth, there's a section called the Etymologies, which has it dates from about 1940, so it's actually in the middle of when Tolkien was writing The Lord of the Rings, more towards the early end of it. Tolkien tried to put down all the facts of Elvish vocabulary as he could come up with them. So it represents a certain stage, but it gives you a really good idea of how Tolkien thinks about his language. And you can see he puts has a section for each root of an Elvish word, and then all the words that are derived from it in Quenya and in Sindarin, which at that time he was calling Noldorin for reasons, and some other Elvish languages that he was working on at that time. And I didn't want to sort of just reproduce that in my book, but I do have a list of roots that appear in Sindarin and the words that derive from those roots, as well as a list of words which appear in Sindarin for which we don't actually know what the root was. But it's a good way to sort of get a grasp of the way Tolkien approached language, but it's just good to remember that that's, it's one stage. And there was a point where it was I don't know, 60 or 70% of what we had as far as Elvish vocabulary. And so I think sort of in the history of studying Elvish languages had more of a dominant influence over the study than it really deserved. But I still think it's a pretty good place to start. Also, I would, as I mentioned, if you can find a copy of The Road Goes Ever On, the songbook, those explanations in the back are very good ways to get started, and this has this extensive commentary by Tolkien on what he was trying to do when he wrote Namarie and Elves.
Yeah, that sounds good and very helpful, I think, for those who are interested in learning more. Do you have any stories or ideas you would like to add about what you thought about Tolkien or his elves, growing up, or even now today as an adult? Any last remarks about them, or?
Well, I'm very pleased that people are paying attention to this work. I think not even so much for what it is in itself as to where it can lead you, because it does help people to start thinking about a world beyond what they can just see around them. And even when I started to read The Hobbit, as I said, I was just fascinated by this world, which I had never seen, but somehow seemed very familiar as well. And it can get you interested in all kinds of things: history and biology and different kinds of legends and cultures, and of course linguistics, art and music and lettering, and you can then, as you learn more about these things and appreciate both the concept of the elves as a people, as a culture, and the way those things have reflected some aspects of human culture and the way that they could be reflected again in human cultures now. You get there's a sort of mental liberation, maybe even a spiritual liberation, in which you're no longer forced to think in the ways that some parts of your society would tell you to think. You can build and create ideas for a different kind of society, different kind of way of life, and you're not limited by what people are going to tell you is real and factual and undeniable, and that's just the way it is. But at the same time, you don't have to be limited by what Tolkien says. Tolkien is giving you one image, admittedly a very detailed perspective on this, but I think everybody gets to do their own creative bit, and hopefully, if we all work, if we all create, we can produce something that's better for all of us.
I like that. That sounds like a good plan. Who would you consider to be more part of the hobbits, the wizards, the elves, or man in Lord of the Rings?
I think there's a little bit of all of those in me. Like hobbits, I enjoy nice, comfortable fireside and good things to eat and drink. Like elves, I enjoy nature, and I believe that we should try to live in a way that's in conformity with nature and doesn't weigh heavily on it. And I also love beauty and art and knowledge. And I think maybe one of the most important things we can learn from the elves is thinking for the really long term, and remembering that things don't stop just when we die. And all we have to worry about is getting as many toys as we can when by the time we're dead, and then who cares what after. Elves have to think for a longer term, because they have to see the story out to the end of the earth, whenever that is. And I think we could learn something from that. And like wizards, I can sometimes be a little temperamental, and I may not spend. I do spend a certain amount of time wandering around the land, trying to get a sense of what's going on far and near. I don't do quite as much traveling as I did once, but you can also do a lot of traveling in your mind. And I think we all need to find a kind of flexibility to deal with a lot of things that are strange and new, because more than ever, our world puts all of us humans, our billions of human beings, all of us kind of sitting on top of each other right now. And we have to learn how to get together, to deal with each other. And I think a sort of a wizardly perspective of not um, not being too enmeshed with our ideas of ourselves.
Yeah. And the elves are good with that too, because it's about living in harmony. And I agree. We have to start doing that for sure.
We have the story of Feanor, who got the idea that the Noldrin way was the only way. His family's way, especially, was the only way, and anybody who didn't agree had to get out of the way or be tossed aside. That didn't work out too well for him in the long run, but there are now a lot of humans who have the idea of the superiority of their own ways above all others, and we could learn the lesson of Feanor and try not to be like that.
I like that, and become more like the elves of the Third Age rather than the elves of earlier.
Some of those difficult lessons, and also kind of could see human beings making some of the same mistakes that they had made when they were younger.
I agree. Well, this has been really wonderful. I think that's all we need to really talk about. But if anybody has any questions or anything like that, is there a way to reach out to you? Do you have like a website, or is there any way that people can contact you with any questions? Or
I don't currently have a website. If people want to send me emails, and if it's something that I can reply to with a short answer rather than having to write one of these very long pamphlets that turns into a book, then I will be happy to answer. So shall I provide my email address?
Sure. And then I will add that. Do you have any other books in store that you are thinking about writing?
I would really like to do a revision of this one, but at present, it's far more likely that if I do come out with a publication, it's going to be something of my own, fiction or poetry, stories, or possibly a language of my own invention.
Wow. Well, I would love to read that one day. That would be great. So thank you so much for coming on. I think that people have learned a lot, and what I think was really great about this is that Tolkien had a great quote that I found and I used in one of my videos, that he believed that he created his story through kind of putting down roots in the past, and then it grew unexpected branches later on. And I feel like that's exactly what's happening now, is like we're in almost 2020 and we're still talking about the Elven language. So obviously those branches have even grown further than he could even imagine. And I really do think that, because I think that he was a modest man, and I don't think that he necessarily saw that maybe this is the type of influence that he would have. And and I think that it's great that you say, as an Elven linguist, that there's still room to grow, and that the Elven language is not dead, that it can actually be revived in a lot of ways by others creating new words that could kind of complement what Tolkien was already envisioning.
Languages are, in their essence, they're living creatures, and they want to grow, they want to develop. And as soon as there's a critical mass of people who are able to use them, they will just start naturally growing on their own. So the only question is when we'll have enough people who are interested in these things and are working together.
I definitely think so. It won't be me. I'm not that I guess focused on that part of the Elveness, but I think that there will be somebody in the future that will be able to create more words and make another book or a website that would add to it and just kind of, go off of your own research as well as what they've learned about Tolkien as well. So I think that we have a lot to look forward to, and that the future is bright for elven souls and those that really love the elves and want that kind of elven culture in their life. And I love everything that you said because it supports everything that if everybody got in touch with just a little bit more elven nature within them, this world could be a more peaceful place, and we could live more closer in connection with nature, which really, I mean, we are nature ourselves, our whole body and everything. We're made of the minerals and everything that the earth is, but it's about getting our mind back to that place of feeling that connection once again. And that's going to take some time, but I think that we are heading that way. I know that there's a lot of people who are really taking a stand, for Earth and just trying to be those reminders. I do consider them elven souls in that idea, that they came to Earth with that kind of drive or that passion to bring that reconnection back to nature. So. Okay, well, thank you so much, David. Do you want to say any last things? Do you want to say anything in Elvish for everybody to hear? As your word.
Actually, I do have a thing that I was just considering. I mean, obviously, as a person who's studied Tolkien's languages, I have a great deal invested in that. But if you look at the way that Tolkien thought about his own creative process, and there's a sort of fictionalized version of this in one of his works called the Notion Club Papers that he didn't quite finish, but it describes a person not unlike Tolkien in being a linguist and being attuned to language, who starts one day in his youth having strong auditory impressions of words and finding over a long period of study that these actually form several new strange languages that turn out to be part of an important past history of his world. So Tolkien is kind of telling us there that in accordance with our own preferences and our own understanding, there is something out there for those of us who are into languages and linguistics. It may be words, it may be languages, but we each have our own individual language, which is kind of waiting there for us to find, and it's accessible if we attune our minds to that. And Tolkien found his language, his words, and spent a lot of time trying to write this out in detail and explain what he meant. And yet, and if studying that is what brings you in touch with your inner elf, that's great. But it may be that you have your own elven language within you that is just waiting for you to find it. And maybe if you study Tolkien's languages, you'll say, this is great, but I would like to find something else that's more in tune with me and my experience and my insight and my foresight. And I would say, go ahead and do that. Don't feel yourself to be bound. Create your own languages. Find out what your elves, your inner elf speaks.
That goes along with the idea of light language. I don't know if you're aware of that, but I have some videos. Light language is basically speaking from your soul, but not really intelligible words. It's more like sound that come out. And so I have done that, and it's kind of been like a mix of different things. And I think that one of the most amazing things about light language in this day and age is that people are making YouTube videos, or they're just, kind of experimenting with their sound. And it's quite literally their whatever vibration and whatever is their resonance within them coming out. And you can't really understand what they're saying, but it's more like a feeling that they're giving. So it's actually very elvish in the idea of that it's connecting to the emotions. That's kind of what light language is, without the actual words and definitions, but rather a feeling behind every sound. And I think in a way that Tolkien had used his Elven language like a light language. And, that was my kind of analysis of it. But yeah, I think that it correlates to that. And I'm glad you said that, because it means that, like I said, there's room to evolve and to grow the Elven language. And hopefully we will see it continue to grow into something that maybe can be used for future humanity. I mean, that would be amazing. And yeah, I have my own ideas about that, but I think that this gives a very good foundation for it. And so everybody, please try to grab his books, and also take a look at the websites that he also recommends. And also go on YouTube, and David Salo has a couple interviews, and you can actually hear him reciting a poem. I actually shared it to my Facebook page. So you can actually hear him doing a lot more speaking Elvish than he did tonight. Are you shy tonight?
I have nothing more to say than that. So
yeah, because there's a lot of recordings already, so people can listen to you if they want to hear you speak it. But you did a beautiful job in just saying some of the words that we already have heard before, and helping us, pronounce them a little bit more Elvish. And I think this is a wrap. Thank you all for joining us, and Namarie. And yeah, we'll see you on the next video. Bye-bye.